Hello, YouTube. I hope all of you have been well. Welcome to another edition to the Get Real series, baby. This is where you will receive no self-censoring, where I make it clear I am not here for your entertainment, to coddle you, or to provide a worldview that makes it easier for you to sleep at night. Nor do I take responsibility for your reaction to my content. If you have a problem with my video, please make your respectful dissent known in the comment section, or better yet, generate a video reply. Oh, and by the way, this particular video is unscripted for those of you who like this sort of thing. Anyway, I say this so that you may give me some leniency. Maybe overlook its lack of polish and the fact that I want to speak with you but do not have much time to put into the visual parts of this video. Oh, and if you need discussions nicely arranged, forget it. Move on. This will not be for you because I cannot predict how the flow of conversation will go. I will spare you the irrational propaganda, imaginative imagery, or political histrionics that is so plentiful in so many people's presentation regarding the topics that we will discuss tonight, or today, whatever time it may be for you.
As constitutional law professor Adam Winkler writes in his 2011 book, Gunfight, for most of its history, the NRA actually promoted reasonable gun safety laws. NRA leaders lobbied states to enact gun control legislation in the 20s and 30s. It wasn't until the 1977 NRA meeting that a radical faction turned the NRA into the fierce anti-gun control lobbying machine it is today. As the New York Times wrote of Mr. Winkler's reporting, in the case of NRA hardliners, they succeeded in pushing the group to the right, riding the wave of conservatism that helped bring Ronald Reagan to the White House. Since then, the gun lobby has become even more militant, to the point at which many members not only reflexively oppose any attempt to regulate guns as leading to a slippery slope to involuntary disarmament, but also attack those who advocate for gun control, including police chiefs and heads of police officer associations.
The gun industry has been in a slow and steady decline from the early 1970s. As the population becomes more urban and less rural, fewer and fewer households are buying guns. And as a result, the gun industry is forced to rely on selling more and more guns to a smaller and smaller pool of people in order to maintain their profit margin. And it's hard to do that unless the gun lobby effectively becomes the trade association for the firearms industry and operates on a business model based on fear and paranoia, which is what they've done for the past few presidential cycles.
So they ratchet things up in order to have a commercial bottom line be met. We got a brief spell left here. So since Friday, gun sales are up in Colorado. Are you surprised by that? In 30 seconds, tell me.
No, not really. You often see this after a mass shooting, and frankly, it's because people are afraid. You know, they may go out and buy a gun. They may go out and get a concealed carry permit. This occasionally happens. Some of it may be that the NRA, continues to whip up a frenzy, and when there's a mass shooting, people, folks in the NRA become concerned that there's going to be a renewed attempt to promote what they call gun control, but it very rarely happens.
All right, Mark Glaze, thank you so very much for your insight.
Thank you.
The guns exasperate violence and guns cause violence theories are impotent people. Let me say off the cuff that violence is not about gun ownership or the type of gun owned. Do you get that? Violence is not about gun ownership or the type of gun owned. Normally, we see factors like family disruption, succumbing to media violence, poor decision-making, drug influence, and abject poverty being the culprits. You see, it is these that are the reason for investment to commit violence. Of course, there are many more. I just shared a few. So, you got it? Great. With this understanding, let's press on. It has become glaringly obvious to me that corporate media has been instructed to, figuratively speaking, maybe I am wrong, maybe I should say literally speaking, to have waged warfare on the Second Amendment. I think the evidence rests in their actions. More directly, you can see it either in the things that they are not reporting or the things that they are glazing over. One, they never want to admit the obvious. Why is that? Let me give you an example. When we are speaking about these mass shootings and we are reporting upon the individual who committed such a heinous act, we are always leaning towards some sort of excuse instead of considering the obvious. Some people are just wired wrong, make horrible decisions, and are whacked out from Jump Street. Two, most, especially if they are white and commit an act of violence with a gun, are often declared, you got it, mentally ill. Likewise, most non-whites are without what? Come on, I know you have the answer. Without civilizing influence and a threat, because of this, to the public. Though they would never necessarily come out and say that, but hey, but there are always implications and framing of various topics of discussion in order to get the point across. 3, sidestepping the contributions of what? Certain drugs, like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or what some would normally refer to as SSRIs. Isn't it interesting? The frequency of people committing mass shootings that have been prescribed these particular medications. I think it is. 4, the obvious disconnect that they, the media, enforce with the promotion of gun-free zones. You would think journalists and reporters would really look deeply into various stories and give you all angles and tell you what they understand to be truth based on evidence that they have collected and present that evidence so it can be verified by the public. Do they? Do they? I don't think so. Yet they ignore that crazies, or those that are strung out on drugs, you know, the ones that change your serotonin level. And criminals will not see the golden opportunity to harm people who are instructed by law to relieve themselves of their personal protection. Seems fishy to me. 5, where are stories, speaking of national coverage here, of law-abiding citizens that either present their weapons and end up halting an act of violence due to its presentation, or the news regarding those who employed their weapons legally and rightfully defended themselves? Yes, the media is brilliant in what they do. So, is it more apparent to you that the state is rotting from the head down? All is not well at the top of the political hierarchy. Yeah. Call me a loon if you must, because you claim I am presenting poor reasoning. Call me unpatriotic because I do not like the idea of being dependent on a government or any of its agencies to ensure my safety or well-being. Forgive me for not being an upholder of the orthodoxy. Oh, and as we speak about dependency, I will pass on that. I don't need it. Thank you very much. Thank you kindly. Dependency has always seemed like a form of slavery to me. You know, it is revealing regarding the probability of human behavior when a woman or man is abused by their spouse. If the abuse is dependent on the abuser, they are inclined not to see that it is the abuser that is at fault. Why? Because their living situation, their dependency comes under threat. Do you see how that may relate to the reality that we are experiencing today?
For the most part, the African American community has been resistant to the right to keep and bear arms for a cultural reason. We have, since the 1630s, been cultured, figured, put together, legalized, any word you can throw that has made it illegal for a person of color to own a firearm. And when you have your mother, your grandmother, your maternal person who says, I want to keep my son out of jail, out of a work camp, from being hung on a tree, over and over again through centuries, we get kind of ingrained in us not to have a firearm. And then when you move out of the country where it's acceptable, where it's normal, and you move into the city where you're packed in, where you're tight, and we have the media who's telling us reinforced negatives, even religious figures reinforcing that it must be the inanimate object known as the gun that's the reason for your unemployment, for your drug addiction, for the government abuse. You can put a face to something. You say, well, it's the gun, it's not me, it's not Johnny, it's not Susie, it's the gun. And we almost have a Stockholm syndrome where we are conditioned to blame something, to not want to get in trouble. And it's not until recently there's been our military veterans, our law enforcement people, quite a few people of color that have said, no, that's not correct. Everybody has the right to keep and bear arms, all law-abiding people, regardless of color.
We live in a world where people insistently use deceit to promote their agenda. This understood, we would be wise to understand we have psychological processes at work. So attempting to understand why people behave so irrationally may not only save you from a migraine, but spot patterns in their communicative efforts. The supposed national gun debate that is dividing the country seems more like lies, lies, and more lies, excuses, inadequate reasoning, and employment of defensive mechanisms like projection. There are many reasons, for example, why black people have been reported as being anti-gun. My experience, which is not definitive at all, repeat, not definitive of the whole or the collective of the subgroup from the group called humanity, has shown more like a 70-30 split, with 70% being anti-gun in various degrees. This claim of blacks are anti-gun is yet another claim used, especially in hot political climates, yet another one that establishes an us versus them barrier. I think it is not as pervasive of a worldview as one may report. I will address one reason I see, though I may be incorrect, why I see it being so, that is. Let's pad my words with a disclaimer, strictly for sake of clarity. I see this in the other groups that exist within our world as well, what I'm about to state, just not to such an extreme, okay? Now let's move on. I see projection at work. It is a defense mechanism, projection is. My understanding of defense mechanisms is that they are unconscious psychological mechanisms. Its mission is to protect us from feelings that we cannot consciously accept. They roam and operate without our awareness. This allows us the ability to not have to deal consciously with verboten impulses and feelings. Projection appears to be, well, a particularly injurious defense mechanism. Why? Because not only is dealing with one's own feelings absent, but the process creates a world where one perceives everyone else as directing their own hostile feelings back at them. So, if one feels repressed or oppressed, no matter if the feelings are genuine or not, no matter if it is true or not, especially when they are unable to clearly voice it and defend their position, this can unconsciously be projected as an unacceptable feeling not owned by them but placed on others. I am sure I will be called a sellout for this working hypothesis. Frankly, I don't care. However, I want to know, are you getting it? Do you know where I'm coming from with all of this? Okay, let's drop this from consideration and let's broaden the scope while commencing. When people wrongly perceive others as seeking to harm them, they are more inclined, I think, to advocate the disarmament of ordinary people. Speaking of those who have no desire to harm anyone, this is who I am addressing when using the word ordinary. Once something is perceived incorrectly, then we have opportunity for something to be used or to restore or to justify one's worldview. It could be as simple as people who have rage within, whether it is rightfully existing or not, and have yet found appropriate ways to deal with it. The fairly large, and historically speaking, most hysterical anti-gun groups include disproportionately large numbers of blacks, women, and Jews, from my experience. For those who may be interested, I will be looking into the actual numbers when I have time, but it will be a while because I'm busy. What I have noticed is most of the organizations or individuals appointed to speak for said groups are vociferously anti-gun. Not coincidentally, among these groups are many professional victims, people who have little sense of identity outside of their victimhood. This is, how would I say it, particularly problematic for me when I attempt to combat real injustices, though the state of realness is not always determined by an incident supported with facts. You see, evidence can be cloaked or removed, making identification of misconduct amazingly difficult. Okay, now with that said.
And those in power have known how to manipulate us with fear. I was fascinated by that subject when making Bully for Columbine, of how fear is used to the point where everybody feels like they've got to have a gun in the house. Now, not every house has a gun, but we've got over 250 million guns in people's homes. And they're mostly in the suburbs or rural areas where there's virtually no crime and no murder.
Michael Moore had one thing to say about race that on top of what you just saw.
Yeah. So he says, what are they really afraid of, considering the fact that most of these are in suburban, rural homes? It goes right down to the heart of our race problem that we still haven't resolved in this country. And he also talks about the history of the fake wars and all that. Some of those have been over the questions of race.
So what he's suggesting is that we've been told and told again that white people are told and told again to fear black people, and so they all have guns.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that that's the heart of it. I think that might have something to do with it, but I don't think everybody's grabbing all these guns just because they're afraid of black people.
No, but
I don't think that's what he's saying either. I think that he's saying that's part of the underlying fear, but that the fear is, it's not about American traditions, unless the tradition itself is fear, but that's what it is. That's why you have so many people in relatively safe areas just buying up as many handguns as they can.
I'm going to largely agree with him. I mean, again, most important, I don't know, but I mean, it's a big part of why, you know, look, we're not talking about a lot of forward-thinking progressive people here buying guns. This is part of that life, part of what when you feel what Fox News and Rush Limbaugh tell you every day is that they're coming to get you. You know, we heard it, and it was part of going to war in Iraq too, is that you're not safe, your kids are not safe because they're coming to get you. And still, we know usually who there is. If they're coming to get the things that you love theoretically, like Christmas, it's me. It's the Jews, right? If it's internationally, it's you as a Muslim. But if it's here at home, who's coming to get you is JR. That it's, you know, and that's been true since the end of the Civil War.
All right. So what you're saying is, if MSNBC's and NBC News's hypothesis is true, that this was a racially bias-driven murder, that all African Americans should take that as a warning sign and arm themselves against that happening to them. Therefore, they should support the NRA. They should support the law that allows you to fight back if threatened, and they should arm themselves. That's what you're saying.
Yes, and I mean, the reason I thought of it is because liberals are leaping to exactly the opposite conclusion, that, oh, we have to get rid of these stand-your-ground laws. They're against the easy issuing of concealed carry permits. Well, as I point out in my column, Martin Luther King, Jr., a Christian minister under constant death threats, applied for a gun permit after his house was firebombed. And the Alabama authorities, under the discretionary gun permit law, said, no, this Christian minister is not suitable for a gun permit. That's how discretionary permits work. People who are for gun control are trying to keep guns out of the hands of the powerless.
You know, that's an interesting, what you did was you turned the tables on the left and their agenda, there's no doubt about it. It's interesting that you cite Martin Luther King, Jr., because the reason he was denied a gun permit because he was black. That was the only reason.
Yes.
If he had been a white preacher and his house was firebombed, they would have had the National Guard with bazookas protecting him. But because he was down in the South, where there was racial discrimination in every area, he was denied the gun permit. And you say that now African Americans should now understand that if what Al Sharpton and the other guys are saying is true, that they are targets of racists, white racists, and those people are coming to get them, the only protection they have is to arm themselves.
Yes, and gun control laws have always been used this way. I mean, this is the history of gun control on these shores. The very first gun control law ever enacted on these shores in 1660, all it did was say that blacks, both slaves and freemen, were not allowed to be armed. That was the battle that Republicans were fighting against Democrats, well, first through the Civil War, but then in the wake of the Civil War, you had free black American citizens, and they had a right to be armed, and among the rights they were being denied by Democrats, not Republicans in the South. I mean, the history books will often try and twist the history by referring to the KKK and the racists as Southerners. Oh, no, the Republicans in the South weren't discriminatory.
Some of them were.
And by the way, some of the Democrats up north were voting against the Civil Rights Act. The one thing all of the discriminators and the KKK sympathizers or KKK themselves had in common was they were all Democrats, and they would use things like gun registration to find out which blacks had guns so that the KKK could go in and take them away, or sometimes just informers who would be given those guns, or the May issue, which we still have on some books today, where the authorities determine whether you're suitable to have a gun, and they'd look at you, and if you're black, you're not suitable. If you're white, you're suitable.
Let's downshift. Fear. Fear. Yes, fear. Fear is a great mobilizer, or it may paralyze. Yes. Oh, yes. It is misunderstood. I think there's more to say of it. Fear can also be a helper. It may create a link where we can readily understand the possible outcome, one that may not generate a desired reality. A warning mechanism, hopefully based on a concept whose truth can be proven. So, once again, if we do not understand how a tool is being used, then the odds are not in our favor and suffering may be around the corner. It was, come on now, it was Roosevelt, that's right. It was Roosevelt that stated, "We had nothing to fear but fear itself." I think he was more right than wrong. If we think logically and attempt to be rational, I think we will find that when a population supports itself on a regular, calorie-inflated diet of fear, several things happen. We tend to resort to emotionalism. We are inclined to be affected with paralysis. Then the magic happens. Due to our inability or unwillingness to administer ourselves, we are motivated to act. We are administered from the outside. history provides evidence that these actions normally are to fulfill the agenda of others, not necessarily something that is within our best interest. We become shells. Shells for someone else to impregnate and to control. This two-party system aids the media, or is it the media aiding them to help the public march blindly to the drum of whatever administration is functioning? Fear helps to lube the machine. So, when we are confronted daily with news of violent or terrorist activity, for example, well, we are likely to keep a self-defeating cycle rolling right over us. You see this readily on social media as well as mainstream ones. Of course, there is always more. There is always more. This diet of fear, which is always presented in an all-you-can-eat buffet, have you noticed that? I have. Helps compound the mainstream media's dereliction of duty. How? Well, laziness for one. You see, it is not uncommon for people to show little, if any, motivation to research anything they have been told, if it comes from an authority figure, especially if their title sounds official and is arresting. What they claim must be true, don't you know? If it comes from one that connects to us, to our most comfortable worldview, or stimulates our emotions, especially in a satisfying manner, well, it must be true. So, fear in those amounts and provide it to those unaffected by self-interest eventually makes use of a medium of insensitivity. That place within that links to an inherent propensity for critical thought, corrective action, and research becomes defunct. So the intelligent among the conservative and liberal extremes especially understand this reluctance. They depend on this reluctance to gather facts, which will help to define this climate of fear as it becomes self-imposed, when fear is not based on fact and therefore is based on a learning process where behavior becomes dependent on the occurrence of a stimulus in its environment. Then we have a potentially dangerous problem. Thank you for your consideration, and thank you for listening.
What? The 4 Ds? The 4 Ds are resonating and ringing hard in the hour that we're living in. Dumb, dormant, docile, and demoralized. That's exactly what we are. But I know what? I know one thing. The reason why we have all these problems is because the moral decay that we have in this society.